You know, one of the challenges that we sometimes face as preachers is when we take a look at the readings that are coming up for the next Sunday. Sometimes they are just so rich that there are maybe dozens of things we could talk about. So what do we do in a situation like that? Well, as I prayed about it, thought about the readings for this week, it became very clear. Choose one thing. And you smile. I know you've been through situations before where preachers have tried to preach everything. And as a matter of fact, I used to tell my parochial vicars when I was a pastor in parishes to just choose one thing to preach about. Because after all, these readings come up every 3 years. You have an opportunity to do more later, so save some for later. And so I'm going to save some for later, but I just want to talk about one thing today. It comes to that second reading in the letter to the Hebrews. Because there we are reminded of Abraham, who was our father in faith. And why is he our father in faith? Because he was faithful. But, so I want to talk to you about what it is to be faithful and how we live our faith, and a little bit of what faith is. You know, at the beginning of the letter to the Hebrews, the writer wrote, "Brothers and sisters, faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen." Okay, so what does that mean for us? Well, let's take the example of Abraham. God told him when he was an old man in the land of Ur where he resided, "Get up and go to a place I will eventually show you." Didn't tell him where he was going, didn't tell him what he was going to encounter. He just said, "Go." And Abraham went. And that's basic to faith. It's trusting and just doing what we know we're called by God to do. But of course, knowing what we're called by God to do is another question. But Abraham just did it. Now, on the way, was he always certain? No. He had questions. He argued with God from time to time. He had doubts. And that's important for us because I cannot tell you how many times people come to the confessional and say, "Oh, Father, I've been doubting my faith. I've had questions about my faith." I said, well, that's a good thing. Because I will tell you, as a priest, those who have too much certainty are probably not growing in their faith because we have questions, we have doubts, wondering about things. That opens us to the possibility of growth. But the important thing is that we stay there. We stick with it. Often I will respond to people in a confessional, "Father, my faith is lacking." I said, well, you're here, aren't you? If you're here, faith is in you. Because faith is about sticking with it. Also, faith is not about feeling good all the time, because faith often doesn't feel good. Faith is something that gets us through life. It helps us. There's an example. A number of years ago, I was standing outside of a hospital room talking to a young man who was quite dedicated to his faith, active in the parish, and his mother was inside that room dying. And he said to me, "I do not know how those who don't have faith can get through times like this." That's what faith gives us. Faith doesn't always feel good, but faith helps us to face those times in our lives when we are challenged, that are difficult, that are tragic. Faith gives us the means to keep on going, to not succumb. And ultimately, it gives us the means to prevail. So, the example of Abraham is a good one. He wasn't always sure about things. He doubted. He questioned. But he stuck with it. He trusted. Even when it seemed impossible. For example, the marvelous scene which came up just a few weeks ago, when the angels came to Abraham and he gave them great hospitality by At the end of the visit, these angels, which he didn't know were angels, of course, at the time, said to him that they would return in a year, and by then Sarah would have a child. Now, you may remember in that scene, Sarah was in the tent listening, and she laughed because she was 90 years old. It was ridiculous. But sometimes faith asks us to accept what seems to us in our heads to be ridiculous and to just continue anyway and to stick with it, even though we don't know what's going to happen. And faith also tells us that in the end, God will show us what it is he wants of us, where it is he wants us to go. So, and as I said too, faith is not about feelings. Too often people say, I can't feel my faith. Well, you know, faith also has in it dry periods. They call them deserts. Times in which we don't feel good. Times in which it feels like God may have gone on vacation. He's not there listening to us at all. But again, if we are faithful, we just stay there. We stick with it. We come to Mass even though we don't feel like it. We listen to homilies even though they're boring. We pray and just do it, trusting that ultimately we'll come through, and ultimately we do. Many of the great spiritual figures in the church, like Teresa of Avila, St. Teresa of Calcutta, and others, spoke of those times in their lives. We all experience them. So when you go to the confessional with that, just recognize you're trying to live your life as a faith. You do not have to confess that you're in a dry period. You can talk about it, but it's not a sin. It's not a sin. It's just the way faith works in us. Also, faith helps us to understand what God's call to us is. Because through faith, we make contact with what is real in our hearts. Through faith, we learn to listen, as St. Benedict said, with the ear of our hearts. Too often, we listen only with the ear of our heads. And that gets us into trouble very often. But if we listen with the ear of our hearts, faith helps us to come into contact with that place within us where love dwells, where Christ dwells. We know what it is we need to do. And it also then gives us the strength that we need to walk through the things of this world, as difficult as they may be, in ways that are loving, compassionate, and good. Faith always opens us that which is loving, compassionate, and good. Faith always opens us to that which brings us together as brothers and sisters. Faith does not divide us. Faith does not cause us to condemn others. Faith enables us to look at each other and to see each other as children of God, worthy of love. So, the challenge to us is to be faithful, which means sometimes just sticking with it, doing what we need to do, living the faith, being open how God calls us, being willing to trust. And also, if we are truly faithful, if we're really willing to listen with the ear of our hearts, we will be open to change, to growth, to deeper understanding. Because that is what God calls all of us to. So the test for us is, are we truly open? Are we open to deeper understanding? Are we open to God's voice as he calls us to live lives of faith?